Well, despite recent reversals on the battlefield in Ukraine and mounting criticism of his failure to achieve what was meant to be an easy annexation of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin so far seems to be in full control in the Kremlin. But signs are increasing that his reign could be in for trouble if the military continues to perform poorly and Russia faces a possible stalemate or even eventual withdrawal. So we're very fortunate today to welcome a speaker who's more than well qualified to assess Putin's chances of holding on to power. Tim Frey from Columbia is the Marshall Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy and Chair of the Political Science Department at Columbia. He's the author of 2 prize-winning books on Russia and has both master's and PhD degrees in Russian studies from Columbia. He will give us an in-depth view of the inner workings of the Russian regime and the strategies that Putin employs to retain and even enhance his power. So, Tim, thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak again to your group. So I'll start off with an anecdote. So in 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea and introduced troops into eastern Ukraine surreptitiously, several of my colleagues conducted a survey of Americans where they asked Americans to find Ukraine on a map. Only 1 of 6 Americans could do so. This is perhaps not surprising. Americans were not known for our great sense of geography. However, these scholars also asked whether or not the U.S. should send troops to Ukraine in order to shore up the country's defenses. And what they found was that those respondents who were least able to find Ukraine on a map were most willing to put U.S. troops on the ground and confront Russia. So I wrote a book that came out in April called Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. The publisher is Requirements. I'm contractually obligated to show the cover. But I think it's a helpful guide to understanding how politics works in Russia. And I think we often get swept up in the headlines and the day-to-day events. And what we really need in our great national debate on Russia is to take a step back and think about the approaches that we use when we try to understand what's going on in Russia to really help us interpret those headlines and events that are, so important. The book is really written to try to improve our national debate about Russia, and it uses some of the best social science that we have to try to understand how Russia works. Are elections fraudulent? How powerful is Putin? What would happen if he loses power? And these questions, of course, have taken on much greater relevance with the intervention, with Russia's war on Ukraine. And what I'd like to do is just talk briefly about the book and then segue into what the book tells us about the invasion of Ukraine and how it helps us interpret those events. So let me start off with 3 ways in which the book is different from most books on Russia. There's a lot of books out there on Russia. There's no shortage of books. So you need to distinguish yourselves. And this book, I think, takes 3 very different approaches. So first, it critiques 2 very common ways that we often think about Russian politics. One is what I call Putinology, which tries to understand Russian politics primarily as the reflection of Vladimir Putin's background and his worldview. So this view emphasizes Putin's KGB background. It emphasizes his the way he rose to power. It emphasizes his interest in history, and it really assumes that Putin is almost omnipotent, in that if Putin wants something to happen in Russia, it will happen. So this view kind of thinks that Russia is the way it is because that's the way Putin is. A second view suggests that, well, it's not really so much about Putin per se, it's really about Russian history. And we should think about Russian politics primarily as an extension of Russia's Tsarist and Soviet past. And in its kind of strongest view, there's a real kind of cultural determinist element here that Russians like a strong hand, Russians have values and attitudes that are different from those in the West, and that Russia is the way it is because that's the way Russians are. And I critique those two views because I think a lot of what we see in Russian politics are patterns that are very common to autocracies like we see in Turkey, in Hungary, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Venezuela, even to some degree in the Philippines, where one example is that if we think about one of the most consequential events in Putin's era, which was the expropriation of the largest national oil company at the time, Yukos, in 2003, and the jailing of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. So some people link this expropriation of the largest oil company to Putin's worldview, that his KGB friends hadn't gotten rich, and this was a way to transfer assets to Putin's insiders. Another view suggests, well, wait a minute, no, it's really driven by Russian history. Russians have long had a fusion of state and economy, and that attitudinally, Russians aren't really predisposed to supporting markets and private property. But the problem with these two arguments is that we saw similar expropriations of national oil companies around this same time in countries as diverse as Algeria, Bolivia, Chad, Dubai, Ecuador, Senegal, and Venezuela. And academic studies from the time show that in autocracies, when oil prices are high, nationalizations of natural resource companies are far more likely to occur. So it's probably the expropriation of this company was probably not due to Putin's worldview per se, or to patterns in Russian history, but to general logics that we see in autocratic regimes more generally. And Putin's regime is like a lot of other regimes in that autocrats face two threats. They can be overthrown by their insiders in an elite coup, or they can be overthrown by the masses in protest. And what makes the problem interesting is that autocrats can rarely resolve both of those problems at the same time. Typically, addressing one of these problems, making your insiders happy, makes the public less happy and makes a protest more likely. Whereas if you direct more resources towards keeping people off the street, that's fewer resources that go to your elite cronies. So the depiction I have of Putin is less as somebody who's driven by his KGB background or as a prisoner of Russian history, but he's a leader who's trying to balance these two different threats to his rule. And what makes the problem interesting is that he has to balance these two threats. So he often cheats on elections so that he's assured of winning, but not so much that he signals weakness. He allows the elite to engage in massive corruption to enrich themselves, but not so much that the economy collapses and people are willing to take to the street. Rulers like Putin manipulate the media and use propaganda and disinformation, but they also have to mix in enough truth so that people continue watching. If it's too propagandistic, then people will just turn off the television and you lose this valuable channel. Autocrats like Putin repress their political opponents, but not so much that there's a popular backlash. So I think if we think about, Putin, this gives us a very different picture of Putin, not as one who is omnipotent and is always able to get what he wants. Far from it. Even though Putin is unchallenged by any political competitors at the moment, his ability to get things done is much less than I think people realized, particularly prior to the war, where the vision of Putin was as this autocrat who was all powerful and was able to get things done. My take is that he was much less ineffectual. And what I try to highlight is the difficult trade-offs that Putin faces, rather than the fact that he's largely unchallenged by political rivals. So the second way that the book is different from a lot of research on Russia is that it tries to use the best social science research that we have to understand Russia, rather than writing about particular individuals. We have lots of good books about Russia that tell the story of individuals either fighting the regime or making difficult trade-offs about how much they could support the regime. We also have some interesting books on Russia that are written by journalists who are on the ground in Russia and tell the story of what happened during their stay, give a very kind of personalistic account of how they view Russian politics. But this book is different in that it tries to translate the very best social science that we have on Russia to try to illuminate what's going on within the country. And it's not really well known, but there's been a real renaissance in the study of Russian politics over the last 20 years. Remarkably, Russia has been a great place to study autocratic politics relative to other autocracies like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Belarus, Venezuela, North Korea. These are much more difficult environments to study politics. And Russia, up until the war, had very good public opinion polling, which is very rare for autocracies. And we could learn a lot about who supports Putin and why, and whether or not people were lying when they answered public opinion questions. Also, Russia has a very well-educated public. They have very good academics. And for the last 10 years, up until the war broke out, I co-directed a research center at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where our job was to publish papers about Russian politics and economics that appeared in international peer-reviewed journals. And in the book, you'll see how my colleagues and I track Russian bots on Twitter to learn how the Kremlin uses propaganda, how Russians use, how we can use electoral data to suss out patterns of fraud in elections, how we can conduct surveys that detect whether or not Russians are lying when they're asked about Putin's popularity, how we can gather archival data to trace how Stalin's crimes influence political behavior even today, and also how we can track political graffiti in Russia to understand how the regime tries to deal with dissent. So unfortunately, though, this really terrific work on Russian politics has had very little impact on public policy debate. So part of this effort in the book is to try to paint a picture of Russia that's more complicated than we usually get in many popular accounts, and also to use the very best research that we have in order to understand what is a very complicated and complex country. The third way that the book differs from a lot of research on Russia is I use it to tell a lot of my personal experiences in Russia over the last 30 plus years. I mix in personal anecdotes about being the target of a honey trap by the KGB in Uzbekistan in 1988, to working in the Securities and Exchange Commission in Russia in the 1990s, to seeing the Twin Towers fall from Moscow in 2011. And I think that these experiences not only make the book a better read, but I think they provide insights that are hard to come by without having spent a lot of time on the ground in Russia. For example, in the late 1980s, I traveled for 16 months around the Soviet Union as part of a US State Department funded cultural exchange program, where 8,000 Soviet citizens a day came to our exhibit, which was located in first in Tbilisi, Tashkent, then Irkutsk, then Leningrad, Magnitogorsk, and Minsk. So we traveled throughout the whole Soviet Union for 2 months apiece in each of these cities. And each day we were asked questions about life in the United States. And just to give you a couple of questions that were, I thought, especially illuminating. So in Georgia, a young man came up to my stand and asked me, you have unemployment in the United States, yes? And I said, yes, we do. He said, that's bad. And, we don't have that under socialism. But I don't understand, how can you have unemployment, but also have something called the want ads? So this was this great example of a Soviet citizen who knew that they were getting propaganda from the state, but also knew that they were only getting part of the story and was trying to put these two pieces of the story together in a way that I think many Russian citizens today are trying to do, recognizing that they're getting some truth from the Russian media, but also a lot of falsehood and propaganda as well. So in writing the book, I've learned the definition of eternity, which is the moment from when you hit send on the computer to release your PDF to the printer, and 4 or 5 months later when the book actually comes out in print. And of course, a lot of things happen after you're done writing the book. But I think the book holds up really well in light of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, because many of the pathologies that I describe in the book, I think, are on vivid display in what we see in Ukraine. One of the things I emphasize in the book is how over time, autocratic leaders like Putin tend to rely more heavily on a narrower and narrower group of advisors who are loyal, but not necessarily the most competent advisors, and that over time, autocracies like Putin tend to be populated with individuals who are less likely to tell the leader the truth and prefer instead to tell the leader what they want to hear, because that is the way one moves up in the system, is by covering up problems rather than by solving them. And I think Putin's disastrous decision to invade Ukraine in expectation that the Ukrainian government would run away, that the military would not put up a fight, and that Russian-speaking Ukrainians would welcome the Russian army, as he was told by the security services, turned out to be completely wrong. And we should understand that all of the decisions taken after the first 2 weeks of the war are done in light of the failure of the initial attempt to collapse the government and to seize Kiev, which turned out not to happen. Another theme I emphasize in the book is that Russian public opinion is far less likely to follow the Kremlin's lead than is often portrayed. For example, if we look at Russian public opinion towards Ukraine from around 2008 until 2022, Russians were regularly asked what they thought relations should look like between Ukraine and Russia. And 80% of Russians were perfectly fine recognizing Ukraine as a sovereign state. And only 20% of Russians thought that Russia and Ukraine should unify into a single government. And this was a question that was asked repeatedly. So there is a sense that Putin has been largely swimming against the tide of Russian public opinion in his decision to invade. And if we look at public opinion toward sending Russian troops into Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, only about a quarter of Russians supported that move. So we are seeing a big rally around the flag in Russia as Putin's support has gone up. But that's a normal phenomena that we see in countries at the start of war. And I think we're already seeing support for the war soften. People are paying much less attention to the war, watching news less frequently. And we should remember that when Putin mobilized Russian troops, 300,000 young Russians headed for the borders, which is also, I think, a pretty strong signal about how important Ukraine is for most Russians. And for most Russians, they have much bigger issues to think about. Finally, another point that I make in the book is that because Putin has so concentrated power in his own hands, there are few other institutions that are able to check the power of the autocrat. The parliament is too weak to do anything to really check Putin. The United Russia Party is nothing like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which provided a check on rulers. The business community is largely dependent on the state for a tilted playing field and for state contracts that have made people rich, and they really don't supply much of a constraint on Putin. But this is a problem because it means that mistakes like the invasion of Ukraine are more likely to happen because there's no kind of checks and balances on the ruler. Moreover, it makes conducting negotiations with the Russian state that much more difficult because you have to rely primarily on the word of Vladimir Putin to abide by an agreement rather than on some institutions that might be able to check the leader and hold the leader accountable. As we see, up until the invasion, Putin denied that there was going to be the introduction of Russian troops into Ukraine. Putin denied that there was going to be an annexation of Ukraine in 2014. In 2003, Putin signed a treaty that recognized the sovereignty of Ukraine. So Putin's word among the Ukrainian elite is really a pretty weak reed on which to have negotiations. So in this way, the structure of the political system, makes it more difficult to reach an agreement. Now, it's important, I think, to note that the decision to intervene in the war was largely Putin's decision. This is not a decision that was broadly supported, or it was not a decision that in the absence of Putin taking the lead, most Russians would have been behind. And many elites, foreign policy elites and business elites, are quite unhappy with the decision and were quite surprised by the decision. And Putin did very little to lay the groundwork for why elites should support the war or why the mass public should support the war. And that's why he's facing a much more difficult political environment at home than he's faced in his more than 22 years in power. What we're seeing is the beginnings of some fragmentation among the Russian elites, among security services who want Putin to prosecute the war more aggressively, with other voices who have been really hurt materially by the sanctions and by the start of the war in ways that have really wiped out much of their wealth or have undercut any claims that Russia makes to being a a member in good standing of international society. And for many ordinary Russians, the this war will help resolve the problems that matter most to them is seen as very unlikely. I mean, what matters to most Russians is the standard of living, the high level of corruption, and the slow growth, which has plagued Russia over the last decade. And there's no sense that the war is going to help resolve any of those problems. So what we're seeing is Russians under 40 expressing a great deal of skepticism towards the war, whereas Russians over 60 being very supportive of the war. And in this sense, what we're seeing, I think, is very similar to the US experience during the Vietnam War, where we had this massive generation gap, where for the first time, Americans in the Vietnam War had to question whether or not their country was always on the side of good in international relations, with many younger people pointing out that maybe that's not the case, whereas the older generation coming off the U.S. Victory in World War II tended to see the U.S. as a force for good in international affairs. There's a great parallel in Russia, where many Russians, particularly older Russians, tend to see Russia as a force for good in the international affairs. After all, Russia was the country that did the most to defeat the fascists in World War II, and that is a touchstone event for many Russians. Whereas younger Russians don't see the Ukraine war as their war in any way, particularly after the mobilization. And the mobilization has really changed the way ordinary Russians see the war. Whereas prior to the mobilization, about 75% of Russians expressed fairly low degrees of stress about the war when asked directly about it. And only 25% of Russians said that they were experiencing anxiety because of the war in Ukraine. After the mobilization, those numbers reversed, where 75% of Russians said that they now felt anxious about the course of the war versus 25% who did not feel anxious about the course of the war. So Putin is still largely unchallenged by political competitors. Alexei Navalny is still in jail and unlikely to be released anytime soon. There are no open challengers to Putin, but the level of discontent is much higher than we've seen in the past. And what the war has done is really broken the societal consensus that Putin had managed to build over 22 years in power, in a way that has fragmented both the elites and the masses, and made his balancing act of trying to keep people off the street and to satisfy his inner circle all that much more difficult. So with that, I think it's a good time to open up the floor for questions. And again, I want to thank everyone for their comments in advance, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. Let me ask the first question if I could. And I've got a ton of possible questions here, but I'll start with one, and I'm sure we'll...
Tyler, please start your video.
Okay.
Okay.
We'd love to see you.
Okay.
There he is.
There you go.
Okay, there we go. Okay, among other commentaries that I've read about the situation, Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, recently wrote a piece cautioning the U.S. to not overdo it in terms of pushing back hard on the Russians in this whole process, saying that we've got to be willing to compromise to avoid provoking Putin too much, because he may get emotional about pushing back and making this into a 5 or 10 year conflict. And he pointed out that we will eventually, or the West will need some resupply of Russian oil and gas at some point. The fact that we're coping just barely with cutting off the oil and gas is obviously a slight positive in coping with this situation, but it certainly doesn't resolve the supply issues. So I wonder what your thoughts are on his advice that the U.S. is perhaps getting a little too aggressive in its dealings with Putin and should tend to back off and be willing to accept an ultimate negotiated compromise.
Well, I'm a big fan of Richard Haas, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So far be it from me to disagree, but I do have some sense of concern with that point of view, in that it all depends on what a negotiated settlement would look like. And I think a settlement that rewards Putin and allows him to take more territory is unlikely to be a lasting resolution to the conflict. Ukraine will continue to fight. We've seen, Putin, the war began in 2014, 2015. It didn't begin solely on February 2022. So Putin's problem is that any compromise that he makes, he has a very difficult time making that compromise incredible, rather than just as a breathing period to perhaps attack later. So I'm fairly skeptical of reaching a negotiated agreement with Putin at this point. And there are also costs to raising the prospect of negotiations at the current moment. This would be a signal to Putin that the West is not fully committed to backing Ukraine. It would also, and I've heard Richard Haas make this argument earlier, that raising negotiations too early also raises the prospect of splitting the alliance in Europe. I mean, the most important tool that the US has in keeping Putin in line is the unity among the Western alliance. And if you raise negotiations too early, that could be a very divisive issue with the more hardline elements within NATO, Poland, the Baltic states, and the East European countries, taking a very different stance than, say, Germany and France, who might be willing to cut a deal. So there are risks to raising the prospect of negotiations too early before there's a real prospect for those negotiations to be successful. And I don't really see much prospect for negotiations to be successful at the current moment. In part because the Ukrainians still feel like they've lost territory and would be unwilling to recognize the gains that Russia has made since February 24th. And at the same time, it's hard to see Putin settling for anything less than an expansion of at least some territory gained after February 24. So if the negotiations are at the very rudimentary level of let's try to keep the conflict from going nuclear, that's fine. But I think anything more focused on trying to bring the conflict to an end, given where we are right now, is not likely to succeed and could leave a bad taste in everyone's mouth. So.
Okay, thank you. Let me follow on with another question. Putin, as you know, is very, very historically oriented. I guess you would, not a good way to put it, but he always reminds us that there is a phenomenon historically called the Kievan Rus. And he referred to it, he's referred to it all the time, but in a speech last year in 2021, he again reminded us that, or reminded the Western world that in his opinion, which I would gather is probably subscribed to by most of the Russian leadership, maybe not all, is that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine are all descendants of what is called the Kievan Rus, and they're bound, according to him, by a common language, territory that all adheres to a common mass, and the Orthodox Christian Church. What are your thoughts on the Kievan Rus? Is he kind of falling back on this just as a convenient excuse to try to convince people that Ukraine is really part of Russia and we shouldn't worry about it in the West?
The only thing more dangerous than a historian is an amateur historian. That's one way to put it. I mean, this argument is flawed in a number of ways. First of all, to say that that Ukraine has been part of the Russian Empire, during Catherine the Great's period and during the Soviet period, doesn't mean the Ukrainians were happy about it. So it's a bit like, saying, well, Ireland's been part of the United Kingdom for a long time, so it should not have any self-rule. The languages are different, the cultures are different, and it's not up to Putin to decide for the Ukrainians who they should ally with. And Putin's notion that the nations should have their own states is a very it's a very 19th century way of viewing ethnicity and national identity. I mean, if this were the case, then Africa would be broken up into thousands of little states. And the notion that there could be states that have heterogeneous ethnicities or have diverse populations would be seen as, kind of illegitimate in a way that I think is really problematic. Even Russian speakers within Ukraine are Ukrainian citizens, and they have fought valiantly on the side of Ukrainians against the Russian troops during this war, in part because of the heavy-handed way that Putin has prosecuted this war. So even some Russian-speaking Ukrainians who might have been sympathetic have really been turned off by the war crimes and by the just tremendous destruction that Putin is causing a country that he regards as his brothers, right? A fraternal country. It's a very strange way to show your love for a country by bombing it into submission. So yes, there are historical roots. Yes, but the notion that this justifies a war is just hard to fathom. I mean, the U.S. and Canada have a common culture too. In a lot of ways, speak a language that's even closer than the Russians and the Ukrainians. But I don't see troops, the real value of massing troops on the border.
Picking up on your idea of using Ireland as an example of why they should remain in the sphere of the Russian Soviets, got me to think that in both cases, the dominating power tried to starve them to death, starve out the Irish first, and then of course there's this terrible period in Ukraine where under Stalin, I guess it was, there hundreds of thousands of people died due to starvation.
It's potentially a dangerous notion to think that states should be based on nations. That just some of the worst atrocities that we've seen have flown from that logic.
Yes, I'd like to just congratulate you on the way that you introduced your topic today, telling us some of the history and telling us the three principal ways that people have been explaining the fate of Russia, as it were, and Putin in particular. And I would like to just carry on a little bit from there and say what we haven't looked at yet is where Russia is finding its friends. And there are a couple of ways to go. One is to go towards Asia, of course, and look at India and China as friends as it seems to be, and maybe others as well. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Russia is primarily a European country. If you look at its economy, it's largely oriented towards Europe, selling gas to Europe and selling oil on the global market. Culturally, Russians identify much more with Europe. They're buying land in Chelsea, in the south of France, not in Shanghai and Chengdu in China. This is where Russians just like 70% of the population of Russia is in the European part of the country. And what we're seeing now is a real backlash, almost solely because of the invasion of Ukraine, where Europe is greatly accelerating its transition to a green economy. I mean, solar panels purchased from China are up by 50% in Europe over the last year. And the European countries have been stocking up on LNG, finding new sources from Africa, from the United States, in order to try to wean themselves off from Russian gas in a way that will be costly in the short run, but in the long run is going to help Europe so that they don't have to rely on an unreliable partner like Russia, and also to make this green transition happen more quickly. At the same time, Russia is trying to export more energy to India and China, and they are. Exports to India and China in terms of energy are up significantly. But Russia doesn't have the infrastructure in place to deliver the same amounts of energy to China and India that it does to Europe. Russia is the low-cost provider of energy to Europe, in a way that in China, it's not. It's one of many suppliers to the Chinese government, and Russia can have influence over Europe. For 20 years, one of its main sources of influence was its energy weapon.
Yes.
And Russia's not going to have the same kind of influence over China going forward, should it really reorient its economy towards China and Asia. So in the long run, this is not a great strategy for Russia to be consigned to being a natural resource supplier to China. So also, arms sales is another source of revenue for the Russian government to countries like China, India, countries in the Middle East. And Russia's reputation as a military power has taken a big hit in Ukraine. So on a number of fronts, the war has not been good for Russia's relations with its neighbors to the west, its natural trading partners, and it's been a difficult transition to find partners elsewhere in the world.
Tyler, may I ask a follow-up to that, which is the relationship between Russia and Turkey?
Yeah, very interesting and complicated relationship. They almost went to war when a Russian airplane overflew Turkish airspace. And in 2015, 2016, during the more aggressive period of the Syrian conflict, Erdogan is playing, the NATO card and the Russia card very well by positioning himself to be an interlocutor to, for example, guarantee the grain deal that's allowing the export of grain through the Black Sea and through the Turkish Straits. So that allows him to play this role as a global statesman and influence, gain greater influence for Turkey. He's bought weapon systems from Russia, much to the consternation of NATO. But he's also voted against Russia in United Nations, and upheld the sanctions, although in a pretty leaky fashion. So Erdogan has really been a big winner from Russia's war on Ukraine by giving him some leverage over NATO, and also by giving him some ability to play a broker role in Russia. For example, Turkey played the primary role in negotiating a ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And that would have been unheard of in the past, where Russia was the main guarantor of such an agreement. But, in this year, Turkey really played that role.
Yeah.
Tim, obviously, Putin has been very, very lucky with a high global oil prices. So he's benefiting with billions of bucks of incoming funds. But on the other hand, do you think he seriously calculated what the longer term damage to his energy empire is going to be or would be, because in the future, assuming that everybody doesn't get friendly and accommodative again, he won't be exporting Russian oil and gas to a major market, i.e. Western Europe. So you wonder about that. You also wonder about what his feelings are about the brain drain that apparently is going on in Russia. And of course, we've had the emigration of, I gather, hundreds of thousands of 20-somethings and 30-somethings into, you name it, Armenia or Georgia or Turkey, etc. So you wonder whether he's considering all these economic elements that are going to come to a head eventually, and I would think put real pressure on him and the regime.
So a couple of points. One is, he thought the war was going to be over in 2 weeks. That was the initial strategy. And then to present a fait accompli to Western Europe and say, we're going to pursue a very punitive peace towards Ukraine. And we expect that you'll continue to buy energy from us because we're the only supplier, or the supplier that makes the most economic sense. Now, as the war has dragged on, Europe has continued to buy a lot of gas from Europe in this year. That's one of the reasons why energy prices have been so high. But what they've done is they've stocked their reserves to the point now where energy will be expensive in Europe. But it's not the case where Putin can, by threatening to turn off the taps, really leave Europe in the cold. So Europe played this waiting game where, yes, they bought a lot of energy in the summer and in the fall when they didn't really need it, so that they could stock their reserves to make it through the winter, which will be a difficult winter, but most people are much more optimistic today than they were 6 months ago. Another point is that Putin might be thinking, look, if I'm able to bring a big chunk of Ukraine back to Russia, it's worth a little bit of economic costs in the short run. If 20 years from now, I'm seen as the leader who brought the Ukrainian lands back to Russia, that he's playing on his legacy here. Whether or not that's actually the case, I'm not sure. And the real tragedy here is that Russia doesn't need to depend so much on oil and gas. It has a well-educated populace. It has a big internal market. And if the country were better governed with less corruption, a more level playing field, it could be a much more prosperous place than it is. But in being a much more prosperous place, it will be a much more difficult place to govern. It's much easier to govern when the main source of revenue are state-owned energy companies that you control, rather than tech companies that are mobile or service sector firms that are harder to put pressure on. So in this way, the reliance on oil and gas is part due to geology, but it's also a conscious choice of the Putin regime to devote resources to developing this sector versus other sectors. And, energy prices are going to go up and going to go down. And in the long run, 5 to 10 years from now, as, countries, rely less on energy, Russia's future looks a lot less bright.
Tyler, we have a question from the audience. Do you want me to read it out on Q&A?
No, I'll do it. I'll do it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. We have an audience member who says, usually wars end when one side or the other becomes exhausted.
Yeah.
How and when might that happen in the war in Ukraine to Russia, Ukraine, and or NATO, in your view?
I think the weakest link in that triad is the West support for Ukraine. I think that is the West is the party that's most likely to get exhausted. The Ukrainians seem to have a lot of vigor and be willing to fight, even at lower levels of Western support. Russia seems much less willing to take the initiative, and morale among the Russian soldiers is pretty weak. But Russia is a big country with 146 million people, and they were able to mobilize 300,000 soldiers, in this latest round, at considerable cost to public support for the war, to the kinds of soldiers who will be fighting this conflict. Most of them poorly trained, most of them with pretty weak morale. So Russia also will have incentives, once exhaustion sets in a little bit more, to strike a deal. But I think at the current time, Ukraine still feels like the wind is at its back, that it can take more territory. So it doesn't really have an incentive to engage in serious negotiations. Russia is counting on the West reducing its support and its sheer numbers and just wearing the Ukrainians down, and being able to, at a minimum, keep the territories that are currently under their control. So as long as the Ukrainians and the Russians see reason and a benefit to continuing to fight, the prospects for a negotiated solution, as the questioner points out, are actually pretty low. And remember, we're not even at the station of a ceasefire, let alone some kind of agreement. Most of the time there's a ceasefire when both sides become exhausted, and then there's lengthy negotiations to try to reach some kind of stalemate. And remember, the conflict's been going on since 2014, 2015 at a much lower level, and the parties were unable to reach an agreement at that time. So unfortunately, I'm pretty pessimistic about the prospects for a negotiated settlement at the moment.
Yeah. Looking at the possibility that Putin may be ousted by one force or another, a lot of opinions are out there as to who the candidates might be to fill that that job. Among others are Prigozhin, who I guess is called his chief chef, right? Or the master chef, I guess. But he is head of the Wagner group. And I guess the Wagner guys are making trouble, as they usually do pretty effectively. But there was an article by John Mearsheimer, who you're probably familiar with, who's very pessimistic about any successor to Putin being any more friendly to the West or any more accommodating or reasonable or willing to compromise or close the book on this whole effort. He feels that they will feel obligated to continue going against, to try to diminish Western and U.S. influence and basically, I guess, pursuing the war, even if Putin is out of there. Do you concur with that?
No. Professor Mearsheimer is an esteemed scholar of international relations, and is less of an expert on kind of Russian domestic politics or Ukrainian politics. And I think what we've seen in the past when Russian leaders have lost power is that their successor often shifts on the main policies pursued by their predecessor in order to build a coalition in that supports them. So if you're a leader looking to stay in power, you need to build a coalition that differs from your predecessor's coalition, or else you'll suffer the same fate as your predecessor, right? So, when Stalin died, Khrushchev had a very different policy towards the United States. When Khrushchev fell, Brezhnev had a much different policy towards the United States than Brezhnev did. After, Andropov died, Gorbachev came to power and pursued a very different policy, and on and on. So I think there's a logic domestically where leaders try to stake out a different position than their predecessor. Mearsheimer's right in the sense that there are a lot of issues on which the US and Russia have very different views. And that's going to occur regardless of the leader. So in that sense, he's correct. The US and Russia don't trade very much. They're competitors in the global energy market. They don't have common enemies, really. That is another way to bring countries together. But at the same time, the US and Russia have experienced periods of cooperation, despite having these differences in outlooks and difference in interests, and it can have a very manageable relationship. And also, I think at this point, there's a great deal of Putin fatigue in Russia, where even his supporters recognize that he's hardly the solution to their problems, and people are willing to go along with him, in part because they don't see a better alternative. But one thing we know in autocracy is that there's always alternatives. And at this point, I'd be willing to take a flyer on a different member of the Russian elite to pursue a different relationship.
Yeah. Tyler, may I ask a question about the communism part of the history? When 8 or 10 years ago, my wife and I were in St. Petersburg, and the thing we noticed was all the money and effort going back to rehabilitating all the Tsarist palaces and even within the Hermitage Museum. I asked, because I was interested, to see some of the tractor art, I call it, the muscular art with the women and the men, and they said, oh, well, that part of the museum is completely closed, and we're kind of rethinking that part. And in fact, it wasn't until we were later on in the year in Evian, in France, when we saw tractor art, which had come out of Russia to circulate. And I thought, what the heck ever happened to communism? Because it's not mentioned anymore.
Yeah, I mean, Putin is often accused of trying to, rehabilitate the USSR, and I don't think that's correct. Actually, I think he's driven much more by the Tsarist period, and Putin has said the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. And somebody who would like to bring it back, or people who would like to bring it back, might have a good heart, but they have a bad head. So, he's in, when he first came to power, he was very critical of the communist period, and the part of the communist legacy that is important to him is the role of the KGB, and that the KGB be seen not as a group of henchmen, but as a defender of the Russian state. But all the ideology, the party cells in every nook and cranny of Soviet life, that's not what really drives an interest of Putin. And also, if you look at Russian society, for people under 30, people under 40, their formative years were not under communism. So one of the big distinctions between Russia and Ukraine is that Zelensky is the first leader of a former Soviet state whose formative experience was after the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
So this is one of the reasons why, he's looking at the West, he's looking at Europe. He's not looking back in a way that Putin is really driven by a backward vision of what Russia should be, whereas Zelensky in Ukraine is very much looking of a forward vision. And, Ukraine, in some sense, Russia has already lost the war in that, Ukraine is already committed to the West. And that's nothing that the Russians can change that.
Yeah.
And that's Putin's biggest fear, is that Ukraine will inexorably move
Yes.
itself west, and whether they want to join NATO or the EU or both or neither, the tendency is to want to sympathize and lean west. So
Yeah,
that's
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think Putin, to rationalize the invasion, saw that process was only going to become more difficult in the future. Ukraine was becoming more and more integrated with European economy. I mean, China had become a larger trading partner for Ukraine than Russia. The EU was its second biggest trading partner, and Russia was third. So the ties were already fraying well before February 2022.
Yeah. We have another question from the audience. Could the results of tomorrow's elections have a real impact on U.S. support for the war? Is there serious Republican sympathy in Congress for Putin?
Up until,
Wow.
well, it depends on how large the margin is. So, if it's a real sweep of both houses, that could make things more difficult. There'll be more scrutiny toward aid towards Ukraine. I still think that there are enough Republicans and that there's enough division on this issue between the pro-Trump wing, which is much more skeptical of aid towards Ukraine, much more sympathetic to Russia, and the less Trump-oriented wing, which has been supportive of aid to Ukraine. Mitch McConnell has been a big backer of support for Ukraine. So I think there are enough, Republicans where, Biden should be able to still cobble together, majorities in support, but it will become more difficult. There's no doubt about it. And also symbolically, it will give some of our partners in Europe who are looking for ways to end the war or to reduce their support to Ukraine. This will give them an opening to do so, to rationalize that, well, look, even the US is not supporting so much, so why are we sticking our necks out? So in that way, there is that potential. So that's a worrisome, a potentially worrisome development. And remember, this has been one of the few issues on which Republicans and Democrats have been able to work together in this last Congress. So it would be really a shame if that were to, be one of the few issues, where there had been progress, if that fades.
Yeah. I noted that a lot of folks were somewhat curious as to why Putin reversed course just about a week ago and agreed to resume the grain exports from Odessa when he had decided to cut them off because the Ukrainians had hit some Russian ships, I guess, at Sevastopol, right?
Yeah. So the strategy, I think, for Putin is to win friends and allies in the developing world. The grain shipments are primarily a way for Putin to say to the developing world, we're going to continue to allow these shipments through so that you can be fed, so that there's no famine and that we're a friend of the developing world. Because the Kremlin has few other places to turn. China, India, certainly, and developing countries, particularly in North Africa, that are heavily dependent on grain for exports.
But on the other hand, it took Putin a hell of a long time to come to that position of allowing those exports.
Yeah,
So,
and yes, I think that's right. One thing that the bombing of the ports did was to raise the dependence of developing countries on this particular source of exports. So it's a little bit like the extortionist that says, you know, it's a nice grain trade that you have here. It would be a shame if anything happened to it. So, you know, Putin, I think, is getting credit for doing something that he should have been, he shouldn't have been doing in the first place. You know, so
right, yeah. On that same theme, I mean, it seems that obviously Putin has scored some very sizable points with the less developed world, if you want to put it that way, supporting liberation movements, in South Asia or Africa or Middle East or wherever, and posing as an anti-colonialist and so forth and so on. He seems to play that hand very effectively. Is there any way he could stumble in trying to do that, or do you think?
I mean, the problem Russia faces is that its resources are just really too limited to compete with China for influence in the developing world, or for the U.S. or for Europe. So what Russia can offer is some military assistance. It can offer aid in developing natural resources. It can also offer bodyguards and military support for governments, which it has done in some cases. But it's a pretty limited repertoire of tools that Putin can use in trying to curry favor, given the just sheer amount of largesse that China can throw at these countries, and also not have any concern about their human rights record. Whereas countries are recognize that Europe and the US, for all of their problems, are better bets going forward economically. So, in these kind of niche issues in foreign policy, Russia can be an important ally. But in the broader spectrum, Russia's playing, their tools are pretty limited in what they can actually do. For all the talk of international brotherhood and, the Russian-Venezuelan relationship is really pretty minimal, for all of the talk about, how, Russia was going to exploit Venezuela's anti-US sentiment.
Well, we have to remember that Russia's economy is about the size of California, so it is in that category and not in the world league such as China is. Tyler, if I may, as the Mal speaker at the moment, note that our wonderful speaker Tim has gone on for over an hour, and maybe we should limit a question or two more, and then thank him for his great performance.
Okay, I'm going to ask one of the questions, though, if I may, Don. Thank you. Sure. Just quickly, the recent move to so-called annex the 4 additional provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk and so forth, when he knew he didn't control them all, I found almost kind of questionable whether, do you think that was a smart move, or was it somewhat laughable, actually? Given that he's actually losing control of some parts, significant parts of those 4 provinces, and never totally controlled Donetsk anyway.
This is a way, I think, to try to lay down a marker, potentially for some future negotiation, to say, these are the territories that we really want. We want to keep this land bridge to Crimea. And by annexing those territories, he's hoping that it creates some kind of focal point for negotiations because there is no natural kind of borders here to that would allow the parties to say, oh yes, it makes sense to draw the borders along these mountains or along this river. It's really kind of an open plain. So I think this is an attempt by Putin to influence negotiations down the road, rather than make any tangible claim on being able to control those territories at the moment.
Okay, well then maybe the last question, if I could ask it, would be, if you put on your crystal ball hat, where do you think we may be in a year from now? Just to pick a point. What's your best guess?
I mean, I'm hopeful, I think between now and a year, there's going to be a lot more destruction, and there's going to be a lot more deaths on both sides. I think neither side has reached the point of exhaustion. Over time, though, I think there will become pressure to bear on all parties to end the conflict, but a lot depends on what happens on the ground. If you look at Russian public opinion, Russians who are more likely to cut a deal are those who think the war is going badly, not those who think the war is going well. In that way, Russia, I think, really needs to be made to pay a cost for this activity, or else they'll come back to take another bite at the apple. So in this way, I think the long-term solution to this war is not a negotiated settlement that's not likely to last, but for Russia to learn that the costs of annexing the territory of your neighbor in the 21st century is isolation, high economic costs, and real military costs in a way that might deter them from engaging in these kinds of activities in the future.
Yeah. Would you not agree that the efforts to take over Kherson are crucial for the Ukrainians? I mean, if they can't do it, and it looks like it might be getting bogged down. I mean, it's hard to tell what'll happen, but boy, they better pull that off if they really want to get into an advantageous position.
Yeah, I think the South is very important, because that could really cause a choke point where Ukraine might be able to push through to again isolate Crimea and force Russia to really rely heavily on the bridge rather than on the actual going over the land. And that was where both sides would fight really very hard.
Well, Tim, this has been a phenomenal discussion. You've covered the waterfront and then some. So thank you very, very much. We appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. And again, let me put a plug in for the book. If anybody's interested,
hold it up right close to the camera.
Russia. It has the paperback version has a new preface that takes into account the aftermath of the invasion. And it lays out a lot of these, and it's really written for a general audience. It's not written for an academic audience. So,
well, you'll have to update it every week, right?
Just to keep this is the problem with writing on a contemporary topic is, you need to have enough. Well, there was this famous example of there's a book coming out December 8th called The Astonishing Rise of Liz Truss.
Oh, yes.
That'll sell a lot of copies. Well, they just cross off the rise and say demise.
That's right. The rise and fall. That's right.
Rise and fall. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I wish I could talk on a happier topic. And but
maybe you will. Maybe you will one day.
Yeah.
I hope so. I'm an optimist, but
we needed to hear what you had to say.
Well, I'm an optimist, but even an optimist like me is straining to look for the silver lining.
Yeah.
So.
And good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the book. And thank you all. Thank you, Tim. We really appreciated you coming here. And of course, to Don and Tyler for all the work that they've done. And I hope you will all come to the next program, which is on the 21st of November, and the other foreign policy discussion group. And again, on this Wednesday, we're having Professor Howard Yaris talking about his book, Understandable Economics, in person at the library. So again, thank you all for coming, and we'll
Thank
see
you.
you again.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Yep,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Thanks, Joan.